Okay, so today I'd like to start with silent meditation. So if you could please sit erect with your feet on the floor and straighten your back. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, 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 namadats. So I must apologize. Many of you know that I am living in the parsonage at the New York Buddhist Church, and I believe I'm the only person in the building right now, and the doorbell was ringing during our silent meditation, so I apologize if you're hearing sounds. Hopefully the microphone's not picking them up. So Michael's tried a new technique this week to send out with the reminder letters, the links for both the chant and the reading. And if not, they're linked down in the chat section below. So if you could please join me with chanting the Sambutsuge, which is on page 47 of the Red Book. Ogen gege eje mogok nyoze enmyo muyo tosha nichigatsu mani shuko enyo kaishitsu onpe yunyaku jumyoku Nyorai yogen chose murin shogaku daiyan koru jippo kaimon shojin sammai chie itoku muryo shushokeru Jitai zennen shobutsu hokkai gujin jin no kugo gaitai muyo yokunu seison yomu nino shishi jintoku muryo Kukun kodai chie jinyo komyo iso shindo daisen gaga sabuts zaisho ho kado shoji mifugedats 不正上位、解任、精進、尿税、三昧、知恵、異常、合成、特物、不行、志願、一切空空、一切大安、形式無物、百千六万、無料大小、収入五者、供養一切、死と小物、不尿愚道、検証不逆、非尿五者、小物世界、不不影、無種鮮度、光明師匠、変死小国、尿税精進、偉人難量、量が差物、国土第一、五種奇妙、道場調節、北女内容、任務闘争、ガット愛民、道脱一切、実法来生、心熱症状、一等学国、経絡安穏、好物神妙、税や心象、発願納費、力小小欲、実法生存、知恵無芸、上量子孫、知や信行、軽量心死、食毒中、画行精進、忍辱不敬、願にしく毒、平等性祭、同発菩提心、往生安楽。Namadots, namadots, 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 namadots. So if you excuse me a moment, I have a little sip of water here. California boy here is having a hard time having New York winter. It's only got to about 35 today, so it's really dry air. So today's Dharma talk, as I mentioned last week, is going to be a little more technical than what we usually do. We're going to be talking about the concept of Mappo, which is a term that is a Japanese term. And today what I'd like us to do before we go into the talk is that, as I've said, with our sessions here on Dharma Breeze, the service on the Dharma talk is going to be a little different than how it would be on a regular Sunday service. So today what I'd like us to do is open up the idea of what time means in Buddhist practice and in Buddhist teachings. We don't usually talk about this a lot, especially in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. We focus about being present on the moment, and maybe we talk historically about who Shakyamuni Buddha was or who Shinran Shonin, the founder of our school, was. But when you look at the general Buddhist teachings in a larger construct, time is very important. And time isn't necessarily linear. So don't worry, I'm not going to go down that path about what these different types of times may be. But I would like us just to sit back today, and while I'm giving this talk, kind of open up your mind about what is the relationship with time in the Buddhist teachings, and does it change the Buddhist teachings? Because indeed, the concept of Mappo says that the teachings change over time. And the idea of Mappo is that maybe that's not a good thing. Going to be a ripe discussion for us at the end for the discussion group. So we know that I think the most common point that we use for Buddhism or general Buddhism is the idea of the historical Buddha, or Shakyamuni Buddha, who was the person that was born as a prince approximately 2,500 years ago and is now what is now India. But there's a lot of other time variances that we talk about, or other schools specifically talk about the time before the Buddha. So again, for us, it's like, I guess some of us that have been raised in the Christian faith, we know that the Bible talks about before Christ, and then there talks about Christ. And so we don't talk a lot about this historical period before Shakyamuni Buddha, but it's got a very rich textual history in the sutras, or the holy texts of Buddhist teachings. So one of the things I like to point out is that we have spoken before. Last week, we talked about Amida Buddha. And so we understand that that there have been other forms of Buddhas. We talked about Amida Buddha being a cosmic or a symbolic Buddha, but then they talk about that there were Buddhas that were on the earth that taught the Dharma or understood the Dharma before Siddhartha became Shakyamuni Buddha. And so I think part of this is that it is expressed most commonly in a lot of Southeast Asian countries is through the Jataka tales. Now, those that might not be familiar with this, we use these tales a lot for the Sunday school or the Dharma school kids. And these are stories that have been collected. As we've mentioned before, that Shakyamuni Buddha did not write anything down. So a lot of times when I have people from other faiths come to me and they say, what are your holy texts? Were they written by the Buddha? No. And we know that technically they were written down by the monks approximately a few hundred years after the historical Buddha died. And what they would do is they would remember certain passages or certain teachings, and then when they'd have the receipts during the monsoon season, they would sit down and they would compare notes. And so then finally it was written down. And for those that are like, oh, well, was it written in the Buddha's words? No, it was written in Pali, which was not the spoken language of the Buddha. So for a lot of people that think that there has to be an official written text from the founder or a prophet, sometimes the idea of us being open about the interpretation of what a sutra is a little disarming to them. But out of that is that the monks had all of these wonderful teachings. They had philosophy, they had rules for the monastery, they had different types of intellectual exercises that they would do. But they said, how can we relate these teachings that we have written down to the larger Buddhist community? Specifically, what do we teach the children? And so they took and consolidated a bunch of these tales of the Buddha before he was born. So these stories are called animal tale stories. A lot of times in English, it's usually written as Jataka, but a lot of times in generalized English texts, they'll say Buddhist animal stories, because the running theme is that the Buddha is reincarnated, again, not as a Buddha, but he's going to become a Buddha. But before he reaches Buddhahood, he is reincarnated time after time again. And in all these stories, he comes back as an animal. And the continuing thread through all of these stories is that the Buddha usually makes a sacrifice to someone that's involved in the storyline. And I won't go into any of the stories in detail here because you can easily find them online or in the library. But there's like one story where he's reincarnated and he's hanging from a cliff, and there's a lion above him, a tiger above him, and then there's tiger babies below him, and that he's holding on for his life. And then there's the mother's above him, and then he realizes through the interactions with this mother lioness or tiger, excuse me, that her children are starving, and that she's probably going to have to dispose of them. Some stories say she's going to have to eat her own children, and so the future Buddha lets go of the rope and lets himself be devoured by the baby tiger so they can live. And so this is a continuing thread through all these different stories, is that sacrifice. Instead of becoming a Buddha, he goes through many lives, making these different sacrifices and these different stories that are very easily for younger people to understand and appreciate. So that's one idea that we talk about. So there's the historical Buddha. A lot of times we talk about the Jataka tales about what the Buddha was before he became the Buddha. And another thing that I like to just gently touch upon is that in Buddhism, we do not have a creation story. And I've had more than one interfaith interaction where someone will come up to me and they say, well, what do you believe? Where do we come from? And for a lot of people that come from other spiritual traditions, they say, well, how can this be considered a religion or spiritual tradition when we don't talk about where we come from? And the Buddha was very clear is that we talk about where we're going and where we are right now. But the reason I'm bringing this up in this context of Buddhist timelines or history is that the Buddha did refer to in the sutras and the suttas about Hindu cosmology. And so it's very complex. I bought a book of it when I was going to seminary, and I was going to be determined if I read that book, and I tried to read it. And then one of my professors, Professor Grombach, she says, if you can understand that book, then you can be my professor. And I said, okay, good. I'm not the only person. So for those of you, they talk about the universe and the shape of the universe, and it's very intricate. Just for us as general Shin Buddhists, if you look at our Onaijin, not at Ekoji, because Ekoji has a very streamlined modern Onaijin, which is beautiful. But if you go to one of the other temples that has a traditional Onaijin, when you look into the altar, you'll see that the Amida statue is standing usually, of course, on the lotus pedestal. But then if you look down the Shamisen, which is the pedestal below, which is supporting Amida Buddha and supporting the offerings and all of those things, is the representation of the universe according to Hindu mythology. It talks about the pyramid shape. And again, so even though in our very Japanese, culturally oriented Onaijin, we do have references back to the period of Shakyamuni Buddha. On another interesting note is that when we look at our Onaijin, even at Ekoji, we usually have a food offering, which is usually obupan or rice, but Eric likes to have sweet bread from Hawaii, which is totally appropriate. We'd like to eat that. Thank you, Eric. But also when we look at it, up in the Onaijin, we have the flowers, but we also have the little vases that are in front of the statue with greenery. And what that is that's another nod back to the Shakyamuni Buddha, where the people would offer him when he would come to a village water, which of course was a very important necessity even now in India, but at that time as well. And so even though in our Onaijin, we've got the food offering and the water offering, which nods back to the time of Shakyamuni Buddha, all supported by this beautiful Shamiden, which represents the cosmos or the Buddhist cosmos. And again, like I said, I tried to read that book. I did read the book. Did I comprehend the book? I don't know. But I think for us as Shin Buddhists, we do get a touch of it when we talk about the Pure Land, which we've talked about in other Dharma Breeze talks. And we talk about the Pure Land and as it being a cosmic place where the Buddha comes. That's part of the cosmology. So Indrika's net, where everything is interconnected in a bazillion different directions. That's all part of this cosmology that goes before the time of Shakyamuni Buddha. So I hope I'm not confusing you, because we are going to be talking about Mappo, which is a very specific teaching in the context of what time is in Buddhism, and specifically in Jodo Shinshu or Pure Land Buddhism. So what it is that, again, there are different theories. No one knows exactly where these theories of the Buddhist ages come from. The common belief is that it's probably created during the latter part of Buddhism, probably a few hundred years after the Buddha's death, most likely a Mahayana concept of that there are different ages that we come from, that we live in relationship to Shakyamuni Buddha. So what it says is that with this idea of the Buddhist ages is that if you are born within the first few hundred years of when the historical Buddha lived, you have the best chance of reaching 100% pure, unadulterated Dharma, that you can hear it from the Buddha. And if you can't hear it from the Buddha, if you're living 80 years later, you're hearing it from one of his disciples that heard it from the Buddha. And so that concept that was like kind of a golden era for us as everyday people to hear and try to comprehend the teachings of the Buddha or the Dharma. So then the theory goes on. Some of them say that there's 3 periods. Some of them say there's 5 periods. But the idea is that the further that you get away from Shakyamuni Buddha, the more diluted, watered down, less specific the teachings become. And so I think you can see where this is going. And this is why I'm bringing this up for our discussion afterwards, because if we agree that things get completely diluted at the end, is that something that we agree with as a Shin Buddhist? We'll be talking about that. So the idea is we have this pure period, the Buddha's alive, his disciples are alive, the teachings are thriving. But after a while, the teachings get to this latter Dharma age, or what they call in Japanese, Mappo. And Shinran Shonin, being a Tendai monk, did his calculations, and his calculations that in our modern calendar in 1052 CE, during the Heian era, that was when we entered Mappo. Now, Mappo, before we get into the definition that was sent to you or is in the discussion group, I picked this definition because a lot of the definitions were very long. I think this one's fairly concise and focuses on a little more of what Shinran was looking at. So the idea of Mappo, if you want to look at the definition, it says here, it's the clearest expression of eschatological thought in Japan is found in the Buddhist concept of Mappo, or which translates to the latter days of the law, a degenerate age in which the teachings of the Buddha are in decline and people fail to reach enlightenment through their own efforts, okay? It's important for us to hear as Shin Buddhists, through our own efforts. Beginning in the late Heian era from 794 to 1185, there was a pervasive sense that the Japanese society had entered to a stage of Mappo, with a succession of great masters as Honen, Shinran, and Nichiren, encouraging their followers to rely upon the grace of the Buddha. So, a reason I'm bringing this up is that this is a teaching that we don't hear about a lot. I never heard of Mappo. I'd gone to the Betsuin for many years. It wasn't until I went to the Institute of Buddhist Studies and did graduate level work where we started talking about this idea of Mappo. And indeed, if you look at our writings that are currently being published or in Japan for the non-academic crowd, we don't really talk about Mappo, because the idea is that, you know, the idea of Mappo is like, if Shinran was having Mappo 800 years ago, where are we now, right? So, but the idea is, and the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I think, again, for the idea of why Shinran and then his master Honen and then his contemporary Nichiren, who created his own school of Buddhism, was so focused on having practices for what we call the householder Buddhist, meaning that, you know, that you do not need to give up your secular life and go to a monastery, that you continue to have a family and have responsibilities, is that they felt very pressing. I look for the list, maybe Eric knows it, but there's a listing of all the natural catastrophes that happened during Shinran's life, and there's like over a dozen of them: famine, flooding, earthquakes, all these things. And they thought it was literally the end of modern, or end of Japan, or the end of the world as they knew. And like a lot of other spiritual traditions, they were trying to have a way for the average person to be able to get through this experience and come out on the other side of this utter destruction and despair. For us, Shinran taught the Nembutsu, that the Nembutsu is a way for us to reach nirvana, to reach enlightenment at the end of our physical life. So instead of this idea of this prolonged thing where we're going to be doing practices like Jataka tales, where the Shakyamuni future Buddha went through many lives and had many different experiences, what Shinran was saying for us is that this is the last life, that we are going to get out of this cycle of birth and death. And so the idea, we don't really need to focus on Mappo itself as much, but the idea that that was a catalyst at this period in Japanese Buddhist history for them to push forward to create all these schools of Buddhism that are the most popular in Japan to this day, that are designed for the everyday person to practice. I think, as I mentioned last week, when I was talking about the subject matter for the discussion, or my Dharma talk this week, I think it's interesting because throughout history, through different cultures, no matter what ethnicity or what culture it is, wherever it is in the world, what time period it is, there always seems to be this concept of there's the end of the world. You know, for us, I think in a modern America, we hear a lot about Armageddon or the second coming. And we have people that are telling us that, you know, the end of the world is going to be imminent. And I can relate to this because my grandmother was a Jehovah's Witness. And so from a very early age, I heard about Armageddon coming. For those that are old enough to remember, 1974 was one of the years that Armageddon was supposed to come. And I love my grandmother. She lived to be 96 years old. and a very spiritual person. And her reading the Bible every day, she was as sharp as she was at 96 as she was at 20. It was great. But I would try not to be insulting to her. And I would say to her, I say, Grandma, what is this idea about the end of the world? Because she would be kind of excited about it because it's going to be a fresh start. We're all going to start over again. But then there's also the dynamic where you're trying to help other people get out of the cycle. So when we hear about the rapture, people say, well, I am not going to be here when it's the end of the world, but I can try to help you by these teachings. And it was the same way with my grandma with her Jehovah's Witnesses, that they had the way to get out of this existence. But when I read about Mappo, and the reason I purposely did not use a lot of quotations from Shinran is because it is doom and gloom. He's talking about it's the end of the world and that everything's falling apart and the Dharma is not true. And especially for myself coming from that background, it's reminded me of like this Armageddon thing, that everything's falling apart. But the idea, again, looking at Mappo, the idea, okay, so people are saying, okay, I will survive, but I will help you. And that's what Shinran and Nichiren and these other Buddhist monks did, is they said, these are the teachings that will help you through this difficult period and get us through this Mappo. But getting back to the more simplistic view of Mappo, which is the degradation of the validity, not the strength of the Buddhist teachings and their sincerity and their essence. That is something that I'd like us to look at. So again, like I mentioned, in modern Japan for several hundred years, and in obviously the BCA materials and the things from the Canadian Jodo Shinshu temples, is that we don't emphasize this idea of Mappo. So before I finish my talk, what I would like us to do is I'd like us just to think about this so we can talk about it in the discussion. So what do you think of the ideas that, because this is what my father, bless his heart, as I've told you many times before, he lived with me to be over 90 in my house in Fresno, is that, he thought that a spiritual tradition had to be pure from the very beginning and that it should not change at all, that how it was 2,500 years ago in India is how it should be in the United States in the 21st century. And so this idea of Mappo, is there, are the teachings lessened? Are they're changed? Is that necessarily a bad situation? Is that negative that the things changed, that how we relate to Jodo Shinshu now and how it was related to Japan in Renyo's time 500 years ago? Is that a negative thing? So I'd like you to think about that for our discussion. So can you please join me in Gasho? Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Dots, Namo Dots. So if you could please join me of reading the Creed, which is on page 4 of the service book or in the PDF. We're going to be reading the Creed number 1. We rely upon Amida Tathagata with our whole heart for the enlightenment in the life to come, abstaining from all sundry practices and teachings, and giving up the trust in our limited self. We believe that the assurance of birth comes at the very moment we entrust, and we call the name Namo Amida Butsu, and enjoy and gratitude for the Buddha's compassion. We also acknowledge gratefully that the benign benevolence of our founder and succeeding masters who have led us to believe in this profound teaching, and we do now endeavor to follow throughout our lives the way laid down for us. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, I'd like to do just a very short silent meditation, and then we'll go into the discussion group. So please join me in silent meditation. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Butsu.